This is what I did in my first book. In my second book on this, I added another axis. Not only probability that something will happen and consequences, but detectability. How long it takes from the time that you know that something is happening until it hits you. And this is a very different axis because it has a negative part. Something can hit you and you know about it much later. Think about a cyber attack. Somebody stole all your customer record or the plans for your next product, and you don't even know about it. You find out about it much later. And if you think about the detectability range, there are things that you find only after the fact. I think industrial espionage, sleeping pathogens. By the way, the COVID-19 had an element of a sleeping pathogen. It was going on in Europe and even in the United States, and people did not believe that asymptomatic people can be infectious. In fact, in my book, I discover how the German scientist who claimed that this is the fact was attacked by the German government, by the Swiss government, by the German government. She was ostracized because they said, cannot happen. People who don't have symptoms cannot be infectious. But it was. Of course, cyber attacks. Now you can have things that are immediate, like tsunami sensors in around the Pacific coast, all around the world. There are tsunami sensors, and they send alert. It can be a few seconds to a few hours before a tsunami hits. Short term, we all see every morning the weather forecast. You can think about medium term. You think about things like deteriorating labor relationship. Something is not going well. You think about superior competition. In my first book, I describe how Nokia laughed at the iPhone. When the iPhone came down in 2007, at least this crew doesn't think the world started in 2007. My students think that there was nothing before the iPhone. But they laughed at it because it didn't have a keyboard. They did the what they call the 5-foot test. They dropped it and it broke, and they said this will never fly. Well, Nokia went from 67% market share to 3% market share, and that part of the company was bought by Microsoft. And you can think about long term, which is more like a trend, aging population, global warming. You can think about lots of trends. And by and large, of course, the danger is if it's more immediate, and if it's long term, it's an opportunity. If you see trend, you can do something about it. And that's why a lot of companies are investing in visibility in order to sense problem early and respond in time. This is, in many ways, during the pandemic, but even before, it was the piece of supply chain software that many companies were investing the most in. The Toyota production system is one of the most important manufacturing and supply chain innovation ever. It really works. And the issue is, at the end of the day, first of all, it creates resilience. It creates companies that are tied to each other, suppliers, you know what's going on with other companies. But at the end of the day, it leads to low cost and high quality product. And some in this crowd may remember that when the system came into being, the US had voluntary quotas on Japanese cars because they were so good and so cheap, they were going to blow the American out of the water. So we had a voluntary quota. So it's not likely people may do something differently and may run the inventory differently, and we can talk about examples of this. But at its core, I don't think just-in-time is going anywhere. Out of China, actually, in my book, it was before the China zero COVID policy, which this may have some impact. But by and large, many companies, again, the press doesn't realize, many companies are not in China due to low cost. Low cost is a diminishing advantage in China. Now, especially along the coast, the Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, costs are up. Costs are significantly higher. In fact, companies that move originally to China for low labor costs are moving out of China. For example, the garment manufacturing. This is now done in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh. Even Chinese companies are not in China anymore. The last stage, the cutting and sewing, which requires a lot of labor, is not done in China anymore. What is done in China is high value-added stuff. You know, automotive, high-tech, aviation, textile itself, the manufacturing textiles, of course, is high-end product, require big capital capex. So Chinese suppliers just became good over the years. They're very responsive, innovative, they move fast. It's very hard for companies to live after many companies invested billions of dollars and 30 to 40 years in building. Again, what the press doesn't realize, supply chain is not where I buy something. It's a whole ecosystem of supplier and their supplier and their supplier and their supplier and their supplier. And they're all sitting there in China. How do you move all this? By the way, it goes down to them or up to the mine. And we can have lots of companies reshoring. They'll still depend on China. So what we see now are companies, and I was writing about it for a long time, companies have mountain of inventories. They cannot build the product because they don't have everything. But whatever they can get, they order. They act like people acted when they thought there's no toilet paper. They just, whatever they can, they buy. And this is dangerous. This is dangerous because of so-called the bullwhip effect, which everybody in supply chain knows about it. So what happens with the bullwhip effect is that the minute there'll be a disruption in demand, due to Ukraine, due to China closing, God knows, the Fed is now increasing interest rate to fight inflation, which may start a recession. And what the bullwhip effect means, I sit on a lot of inventory, so I'm not going to order from my supplier. My supplier will have to start laying off people, which will exasperate the recession. And they lay off their supply and their supply and their supply. It's a bullwhip effect, and it gets more and more. So I was talking about it a year ago, that when I start seeing companies ordering and getting more than they need just because they don't know when it will arrive, if it will arrive, so they just order, and then it arrives after some point, that this does not bode well. We had exactly the same thing after 2008, 2009. We had a recession because companies were ordering too much, and now we are facing it again. So today we see shortage of every part and every product. It started with chips for automotive. For a variety of reasons, this was the canary in the coal mine. But, you know, we have a shortage of transportation capacity, which, by the way, we used to complain about truck drivers. Craig, you tell me how many years we used to complain about not enough truck drivers. And it's really interesting. As an aside, a colleague of mine, David Correll at MIT, does research with truck drivers. And in fact, he was quoted by the White House in Biden's speech. And he found out that most truck drivers, they're allowed to work, 11 hours driving, 14 hours during the day. They work 6.5 hours every day. He said, if we will increase by 12 minutes every shift, every time they work, there'll be no problem. And the problem, for the most part, is the shipping and receiving docks. Most of these truck drivers are treated badly, and people let them wait. They don't value their time and all of this. Anyway, it's the problem. Long and uncertain delivery time. The uncertain is very important because people over-ordered when they're uncertain. They start hoarding. Shortage of workers, and talk about hoarding. High and still increasing prices. Okay, so we have really, in order to assess the US port, you have to visit Singapore or Dubai or Rotterdam to see what a port should look like. These ports are automated. They work like a charm. And then you go to Long Beach with all the longshoremen. It's just who insist on not putting in too much automation. So we have a problem of truck drayage in the port, lack of warehouse capacity, China zero COVID. But the one quote that takes the cake from me is the Fed chairman, who said on June 16, it turns out it's a heck of a lot easier to create demand than it is to, bring supply back up to snuff. And I was looking at this and say, yes, increasing demand, you just give them free money. That's not hard. But supply is physics. There are only so many trucks and so many capacities of ship, capacities of terminal, capacities of railroad. You cannot just increase this automatically. So he discovered it now, which for me was jarring, honestly. The same time, you see, because of this, the China, everything, all the containers are clogging ports. And people stay home. We have this lack of workers. Some people stay home because they can. Some workers stay home because they're sick. And some workers just quit. We have lots of people who just quit.
There's a lot of healthcare here in Nashville. And of all supply chains, I would give them a lot of kudos for how they reacted during the pandemic. The supply chains in healthcare was amazing, how there were shortages and how they came up with stuff. But I wanted to kind of turn it over to like the innovation that's been going on. As much as the difficulty you're talking about, telemedicine, all of a sudden the laws started dropping, people could start doing telemedicine. What other innovation, either in supply chain or delivery, have you seen? Give us a little hope, right? The problem's great.
Okay,
innovation.
Let me first say that in my writing and blogs, I mentioned telemedicine as one of the best results of the pandemic. Because we're going to have now the ability of the best doctors in the United States diagnose, some poor, man or woman in Africa. We will have education give all over the world. That is, in general, the whole Zoom, Microsoft Teams, all these platforms are great. So this is one of the best things that happened out of the pandemic. And the healthcare, absolutely. I always count as healthcare as number one in these things because you can get healthcare to people who did not, and not just healthcare, but high-level healthcare. Some doctors who really know what they're talking about go to places where they were not available before. So that's great. In general, companies are investing a lot in tech, huge increase in robotics, warehouse robotics in particular, increase, as I said, in visibility software, in a lot of software that allow for quick reorienting of supply network. What happens if we go to instead of this port, we go to this port, we move here, we move there, relatively quickly, what are the implications? And of course, people getting used to trying to see how we can continue with hybrid work. I mean, this is something that is still a challenge. I mean, we now have people, remote people, we have people here. It's not the same. It's just not the same. I gave, for 2 years, I was giving lectures and talks on Zoom, and I hated every minute of it. So it's, but we got better at it. The platforms became better. People are start to have, there are actually things that you can do online that you cannot do live. For example, you can start a supply chain program here. You can give, for one lecture, you can give 3 or 4 speakers from different companies, kind of to do a case study. That's very hard to do. It's expensive also to do it in person. So you can do things. We did case studies. It was easy to bring the person who was involved, the company who was involved in the case study, right into the classroom, into the virtual classroom for sure. But so there are things I think we will learn over time how to combine this in the best way. Right now it's pretty kludgy.